Part of the Huberson Project is a discovery. The Huberson Project is a new executive design house which guides leaders toward a new way of seeing and a new way forward for genuine stewardship of self, company, and the world.
If you say the CEO's job is the intersection of all contradictions, the seventh mindset is that the intersection of all contradictions is the opportunity. The far point is the greatest amount of chaos that you can have without the system falling apart. The intersection of all contradictions, when it's integrated, is called evolution.
Yeah, it
And
is.
evolution, it's called life, is at the far point. That's where life is. And so the greatest opportunity for growth in life is the intersection of all contradictions. And that might be the seventh mindset for whether that's personal effectiveness. Your personal effectiveness will be greatly enhanced by embracing the intersection of all contradictions as the far point where life lives.
Yeah, exactly.
It's where innovation will always emerge, or at least the early indicators for the possibility of evolution will show up at the far point, which is the intersection of all contradictions. So that's your greatest hope for personal effectiveness. And if you haven't included that in the vision you've created for your organization, that will be problematic. And if you haven't aligned your organization, if you haven't aligned your enterprise to embrace the far point where evolution and life lives, which is the intersection of all contradictions, then your organization now has the shelf life.
Yeah, it
And
does.
that shelf life will be getting shorter and shorter with each passing week. The greatest possibility for autopoietic uplift, where the system itself uplevels itself, and that we can be a director at the autopoietic crossroad, is the seventh mindset opportunity. That the seventh mindset is to embrace that as the opportunity.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, I like what you're saying, without having that seventh mindset that actually has you see setting the direction. My vision will have to include me and my team and my organization being at the far point as a way of ongoing reinvention or ongoing recreation, because things are always changing. And without an ability to be at the far point, which isn't always comfortable, but it's always exciting, what do you got?
And many organizations and many leaders will see the far point as a problem instead of the gift, or instead of the place to optimize for. It's not a place to get away from, it's a place to optimize for.
Yeah, exactly.
You actually want to be at the far point.
Yep, you do. And a lot of teams that a CEO might work with often resist that or don't understand why that's important. If a CEO develops that seventh mindset and begins a way of up-leveling their personal effectiveness, then how you start to transcend and include how the organization's been set up and what kind of team you actually need to help you do that.
The team might see being at the far point as a problem to fix instead of a place to embrace and shoot for.
Yeah. Yeah. And when it becomes a problem to fix, mostly by not being at the far point, people do try to go in and fix it, and they completely miss the whole opportunity by trying to fix it instead of, wow, what's this opening us up to?
And what if we optimize for always being at the far point?
Exactly.
Every time we get close to the far point, now we have to fix it and go back to stabilization, I guess. And yeah, so much about business is to stabilize our business.
Yeah.
Maintain the stability and safety of our organization.
Rather than creating what the safety and stability of an organization looks like that's constantly innovating and living and working at the far point.
And it's kind of the paradox of our time.
Yeah, it is.
Ironically and paradoxically, that instability at the far point, but remember, it's the most chaos you can handle while still being stable, while still holding. That far point chaos is the actual safety. In that, by trying to be safe, paradoxically, you jeopardize the future of your company
Yes.
because you might get left behind in the name of preserving your safe space,
Yeah.
preserving your market share, and preserving the last dollar out of the last innovation without disrupting, I guess, though that word is kind of being overused in not helpful way, but without the ability to be at the far point, which it's just ironic that would seem unsafe, and it might be the thing that would be the very thing that would make the future of your company safe.
Yeah. So we're talking about a whole recalibration, because that brings us back into personal effectiveness. If I'm calibrated to when I'm uncomfortable, that means something's wrong. Or if I see that something has to change and I need to change and I don't want to, or I resist that, that impacts your personal effectiveness, which comes back around to impacting your organization.
There are people who are the calmest in the center of the hurricane.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
So, and that might be, I don't know if you could call it a strategy, it might be a character trait that it would be useful in the sense of if life is at the far point,
Yeah.
and evolution has moved into a higher gear and change is exponential, and the universe is such that change always wants to up level. Intelligence innately wants to up level. Intelligence doesn't innately want to destroy, although sometimes it can look like that.
Yeah.
Forest fire looks like destruction, but then it's recalibrating the land, so to speak. New growth will happen, and or you might have a volcanic eruption and that looks like destruction, but over a longer scale of time, that was actually a requirement for an evolutionary uptick. If that's what's happening, if that's nature's response to the up leveling on the planet, or maybe just the rescuing of people's ability to continue to live on this planet, because the planet will be fine, just people may not be able to live here, then the ability to get calmer as things get more chaotic might be part of that personal effectiveness. And that personal, how does one become calmer as things become more chaotic? Higher structure of mind. It takes a higher structure of mind to not be freaked by chaos, to actually become more centered and more calm, more centered, more focused, in a kind of both narrow and wide focus. Because great fear will have you narrow your focus.
Yeah, it will.
Great sense of calm and centeredness might allow you to hold both narrow and wide focus.
Yeah.
In a time of great chaos, both of those would be important. So that calm at the center of the hurricane, which might be the embracing of living at the far point.
Yeah.
You're running your enterprise and having the enterprise at the far point.
Yep.
As again, ironically, as the thing that would make your enterprise the most safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Counterintuitive and more likely to be true.
We're in this time in which being able to be at the intersection of all contradiction means things will feel counterintuitive, or it will be counterfactual. You get certain training as a human being in certain job categories, but you don't necessarily get that except on the job as a CEO, because so many CEOs have said, I didn't know what it took until I actually took the position after I got into it. And what you're pointing to is I'm a CEO and I'm stepping into that. And I want my organization to be at the far point because I know that's where innovation and the highest creativity can happen. Then I need to be working on my own personal effectiveness, but also making sure I have a team that does that and that we can put that into the organization. Then the conversations that are happening in the world about work-life balance and well-being and wellness and the mental illness, we could see that as something's wrong, or we could take it as the opportunity to recalibrate. I'm not saying we should sacrifice our health, and we start to go that way when we start to get that stretched, or we are being asked to take on more. So Daniel, I think about my journey in being able to be calm in the midst of crisis, being able to be calm in the midst of multiple things coming undone. And of course, there were opportunities. I think the future provided me reaching back into my life of being an intensive care nurse or working in an ER, and multiple things happening all at once. And you really have to stay on your breath. You have to stay calm at the eye of the hurricane. Those opportunities may come in business, but not always. If you have a mindset that has you think that being at the far point, at the edge of chaos, there's something wrong with that. Anyway, and then I stepped into being a CEO, and it was a different thing. I had been being trained in these different ways, let's say, to be calm at the center of breakdown or upset or crisis or multiple things happening all at once. And when I stepped into being a CEO, it happened to be during a time when we had a financial breakdown, the company had a cyber breach, and then the pandemic happened. And then there were all the stuff that went along with the pandemic. And all of these things were happening fairly simultaneously, or one right after the other. And there were some people that could hang in there. And what I noticed as CEO, that if I wasn't calm at the center of all that, maybe I didn't need to have the answer, but I certainly needed to hold true to the vision. And I certainly needed to keep expanding my capacity to live at the far point, to take in yet these circumstances. And so I could see that at scale, a CEO deals at scale in a different way, even that if I've been in an ICU, which is very intense when a child's life or a person's life is at stake, or in an emergency room where there's multiple things happening. Those are a certain kind of scale. And it seems like a CEO, in terms of their personal effectiveness, needs to expand their capacity. There's you and your personal effectiveness, and there's the team and mobilizing the team and setting the direction. And then there's how does the organization respond? And then, as what happens a lot with CEOs, there's what the business community or the media or the social media at large has to say about what you're doing or not doing with Black Lives Matter or diversity and inclusion and all that. There's something different. Now, I don't mean to set it apart, but there is something different when you're the one for whom much of what happens in the organization is on your shoulders or on your choice or on your perspective. And so there's something about being at scale and being at the far point, and then being able to articulate that to the folks you have to work with around you. And that has to happen fairly simultaneously. During the time I was a CEO, we had those things happening that I talked about. We also had wildfires that came very close to some of the restaurants. And I don't know if you've ever been, I think you probably have, Daniel, but if you haven't been in a wildfire in which the smoke and the haze that overlays everything, it looks like a different place. And so there were employees that were kind of freaking out about that. And some of them had asthma conditions, and some of them couldn't come to work. And yet financially, we needed them to come to work, except how do you pretend that they're not human beings and need to take care of themselves in those circumstances? That's the nature of the dilemma, I believe, in starting to be a CEO or in being a CEO. And what you're pointing to, Daniel, is, and it's still your job to be calm at the center of all of that, and to bring forward the vision, and to bring forward the highest perspective, to be able to have the kind of conversation that supports or assists or opens people seeing the way forward. And of course, the CEO having to make whatever decision they have to make. It happens on so many levels as the CEO is moving in an organization or being in an organization. And so that seventh mindset, I'm going to say, is really critical.
Well, it might be at a certain level that the far point
Mhm.
as a cross-functional, cross-domain, cross-cultural, etc. umbrella of far points that are
Yeah.
that you're simultaneously present to. So it's
Well,
not just a one-dimensional far point, it's a
yeah,
multi-dimensional far point that you simultaneously have to be present to.
that's
And
helpful.
somehow address it at all those far points.
Yeah, exactly. Because they won't all be at the same far point. I mean, at this wildfire, for me, it felt like we're pushing into this new territory in which storms and climate change is truly going to impact us. How will we navigate that? And how do we sort through profit, productivity, human being, and life? How do we sort through all that? That's at the intersection of all contradiction. And this is the opportunity for us to have those conversations and that dialogue, because the old ways didn't make it. We had a unionizing effort, and we had some unions in the company at the same time we were dealing with financial difficulties and this wildfire. And so working with the stakeholders, the employees, the board, the vision, the being at the far point and needing to open up creative, innovative conversation. That's what you're pointing to about the seventh mindset, a CEO's dilemma, and what it means in this seventh mindset with your own personal effectiveness, how that starts to inform or open up conversations to have or directions to explore. I think we're in that territory in this world.
Well, in the sense of personal effectiveness, the mindset might be that there's a practice that is engaged consistently, that is a dilemma, to confront the intersection of all contradictions as the opportunity, and to live at the far point where life is, to hold your vision at the far point and to align the organization to the far point. In terms of personal effectiveness, it means that being more effective and having an ongoing up-leveling of your effectiveness there also means an ongoing practice to become more skillful at that very thing.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
seventh mindset is how skillful are you and how skillful can you be? And do you have a practice to become more skillful at holding that seventh mindset of life at the far point for in terms of myself and my personal effectiveness?
Yeah.
Is not optional.
No,
That
it's not.
needs to be a practice for that. And that the practice is to help you to be that calm at the center of the hurricane, and not just calm at the center of the hurricane, calm at the center of the hurricane while you're embracing vision at the far point, effectiveness at the far point, aligning the organization to the far point, at the intersection of all contradictions. That is the far point, which is the place at which all systems autopoietically evolve. So the point about all of that is that it turns to personal effectiveness. To personally up-leveling your skill to do that is something that requires you to consciously choose to be engaged in a practice of up-leveling your ability to do that, recognizing what that is. And if you have a practice to constantly be efforting and doing a practice to up-level your skill at being that person as a leader.
Yeah, beautifully said, Daniel. Without the set of practices that I have, many of which I got from you, without that set of practices, I wouldn't have been able to navigate. It's interesting that without all parts moving in understanding that you've got to have a set of practices and it's non-negotiable at this point in the world, that's where things could fall away, or the contradictions become more of a problem than an opportunity. The practices will help you see, oh, this is an opportunity. So at the point in the wildfire situation, when I heard a particular communication, I didn't try and talk somebody into why I made the decision. I went into my practices. I went into recreating or continuing to be the calm at the center of the hurricane, with all of these threads that needed to come together to have the direction move. And I was more effective, and there was more for me yet to do. And so the practices will support your learning in the moment, and then will help you see, even in the moment and even in hindsight, what there is to learn or what there is to put in place. Of course, the idea is to be able to keep doing it in the moment, at the time. It all was really, I can say it was all great training in why practices are non-negotiable, what it is to be at the far point, what do you have to really truly be present to, and never stop.
It's not that you do the practices so that you can do the work.
Right.
It's that the practices are part of your work.
Yeah.
Part of your day of work would be those practices, so that
Yeah.
you can be that leader at the far point.
Yeah. That's important. I think that's a really important point. I did both back then. I both carved out the time, and that was my work. And I then let it get away from me, and there were times I didn't carve out the time. What happened to me in either of those instances, when I carved out the time, I could be at the center of the hurricane with much more equanimity than I could without doing, like, trying to catch up to the practices. When I was trying to catch up to the practices, that level of stress went up, and I could be calm, but in a state, almost like in a calm but stressed. And when I had carved out time, and the practices were my work, I felt like I was flowing. I felt like I could see in ways I couldn't have seen before, and I had more space to see what was happening and drop in more to the deep answers that needed to emerge for all the situations that were occurring. And without that, I mean, when I let it get out of hand, I had to reel it back in and start putting it back into my schedule. And that's when I could reorient myself. I could become that calm at the eye of the hurricane and be present to the opportunities that were emerging. It's two very different states. And it really is true that it is non-negotiable.
I might guess that calm but stressed, it might be leaning towards being frozen.
Yeah.
So it's not so much calm but stress as frozen and stressed.
Yeah. And I think it's in this new world that we're in, I think there's a place where CEOs, C-suite leaders could start to look around to see what's wrong with the environment, what's wrong with my team, what's wrong with my board, what's wrong with me. And that will only enhance a downward spiral. So when people start to get anxious and depressed, frozen, they don't have to be. That's again where the practices really do lift you and have you be this calm at the eye of the hurricane.
I remember vicariously experiencing that
Mm-hmm.
sense of one of the major hurricanes hit landshore in Florida. And I was watching a newscast, and the newscaster, weather person or something, was broadcasting from literally the center of the hurricane.
Wow.
But the storm was of such a size that the center of the hurricane was probably wider than a mile. But then he was broadcasting from the center, that center place. And you got to vicariously experience the dead calm of that. Even though you had this hugely destructive hurricane, in the center, it was dead calm. And it really, that's an apt way to say it. It was dead calm.
Yeah.
Eerily, ominously calm.
Yeah.
And the atmosphere is like,
Yeah,
kept
right.
vibrating. But
Yeah.
even though I was hyper calm, it was also because it was hyper calm. It was like do 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 do. It was eerie, but it's kind of in a weird kind of way. It was kind of eerily beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
it was so surreal, and then this reporter right there in this like over like it was I think it was like a 2 mile radius of the
yeah,
calm,
yeah,
and
exactly.
it was having this broadcast from the center of the hurricane. Even though I wasn't there, I have been touched by that permanently.
Yeah,
It's hard to describe. I actually vicariously know what that is now.
yeah. That's interesting that you give that example and the experience of how that impacted you or how that landed on you. Because there were longer than just moments, but there were times when I was doing the practices and there was so much happening and so many decisions and forward momentum that needed to happen. There were times when I could feel exactly what you're describing. All around me could be frenetic or could be this sort of frantic or hyper movement, and I could be calm, hyper calm. And when I could do that, it literally did start to bring this that was happening around just down to a little more, not quite so hyper, but like, okay, let's see if we can use this energy and move it versus get anxious or whatever about it.
Well, there's something about that that moves to another level.
Yeah, it does.
Like that's a kind of a transcend and include thing. That
Yeah, it is.
when I said there was hyper calm, it had that kind of a thing, but it didn't.
Yeah,
Because it was transcended the flux that's like irritatingly agitated,
Mm.
was transcended to a place of hyper calm that was above it.
Mm.
So it still had the buzz, but it was eerily quietly calm.
Yeah.
It transcended that buffeting. It transcended that agitation. It transcended the scary. It was eerily, beautifully,
Yeah.
surreally calm.
Yeah, exactly.
And because it was so transcended, that was the beauty that you sensed.
Yeah,
Like it was
right.
almost above life,
Yeah.
eerily, transcendently, crystally
Mm.
calm, just on the transcendent side of total mayhem.
Yes.
The hurricane, the superstorm. But for
Yeah.
these 2 miles, for this however many minutes, all that was transcended.
Yeah.
And because it was transcended, that's where the beauty came in. It was like level of other something
Yeah.
that was actually the center of this huge matrix of power.
Yeah.
That
Exactly.
superstorm had all of this matrix of power, and it was the center that was transcendent of all of that in this eerie, calm, beautiful, no thingness.
Yeah.
Like there was no, other than him speaking, it was utterly quiet
Yeah.
and utterly still.
And to be able to communicate from that space to the team or to the board or to people in the organization is completely different, has a much different result to what you were saying about the buffeting. And it just starts to transcend and include, be a part of something else that you now can see because you've transcended. That probably sounds weird to business people, but it's true. I think CEOs have had those examples. Sometimes they get there accidentally and don't know how that happened. And sometimes, as in my case, it's cultivated. The practices help cultivate and curate that kind of space so that you can be that at the intersection of all contradiction and see the coming dilemma as an opportunity.
And because the practices are consistent, it becomes more the foundation for having that state of mind, having that set as your foundation, your ground set more consistently.
Yeah.
To be that center
Yeah, exactly.
for yourself and for your organization. more consistently because it is your practice.
You've been listening to the Hugh Person Project, where leading with the future is the difference that makes the difference. Thank you to Lindsay Sterling for the music. If you'd like to stay tuned to further episodes, please subscribe to this podcast. See you in the next episode.